Well, welcome. Welcome to Inforce. Welcome to Boston. Welcome to the deep dive track. Thank you all for being here. If you haven't found a seat, there are a few open seats in and around. My name is Bill Reid. I run a team of solution architects who focus on security and compliance for our commercial accounts across North America. And I'm going to be one of your speakers today. And with me is my colleague, Bill.
It's easy to remember our names, Bill and Bill squared. So I'm Bill Shinn. I'm a senior principal in the Office of the Chief Information Security Officer. I work for Schmidt, who just gave the keynote. And I've been here about 6.5 years. It's been an absolute amazing run. And it's been a massive pleasure to work with so many customers over the years, to walk along their cloud journey with them, to hopefully up-level their security. I came to the cloud because I really think it's a huge opportunity to get an asymmetric advantage in security. It's faster. There's things we'll talk about today that I think will give you the cultural and kind of the way we think about security. So from a deep dive perspective, we'll talk about a few things today. And so it's not a super technical deep dive, just to set up the expectations. The abstract promised a deep dive into strategy and tactics. And so this is really meant for security leaders, so CISOs and their directs, as well as the practitioner and the individual contributors, on how to think about leadership and security culture and what the modern security organization needs to look like. We'll talk a little bit about the traits of what we consider highly successful cloud customers, and I'll define that a little bit more. We're going to dive into some primitives, and by primitives I mean the things you really need to do foundationally to be successful in the cloud. Kind of the organizational things that the people you need to engage with, the stakeholders, and what we've seen successful with customers that are really kind of deep into their cloud migrations and things like that. We'll focus on speed, and I've talked to many of you in the room, probably on the phone or in person, I hope, and I've always talked about speed, and I think it's one of the most important things that we can help with. And last, we'll conclude with some really deep dive into the culture and leadership traits that we're seeing out in the customer base and where we think security is headed as an organization. So what do I mean by traits of highly successful cloud customers? So as promised, the cloud should give you some agility. It should lower your cost. It should allow you to go global in minutes. It allows you to trade CapEx for OpEx and all those things that you're coming to the cloud for. But it also means if you're successful, you're more secure. And so you really can't have a successful cloud migration without being at a minimum as secure as you were in a data center. But we think it's a real opportunity. It's a green field for a lot of folks that are going to the cloud for the first time. And if you're successful in the cloud, you're getting those economic advantages, those innovation advantages, and you're more secure in the cloud. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But first, we're trying to think of, working with Bill on this talk and kind of think of a theme, right? And so I used to commute downtown to work all the time, and I'd ride by this donut factory. And I had lived in upstate New York for a couple of years early in my career. And there was, I got these visions. I would smell these donuts while riding my bike. I get visions of fall and apple harvest season. I used to take my daughter to this little apple farm outside of Albany, New York. And I was talking about this with Bill, and we had some ideas. And
it turns out that that's an apple farm that I grew up right next to.
Yeah.
So
something had to happen with donuts.
It was kismet. We knew we had to
something
use
had to happen.
Donuts and this example and this. But Bill, it's a golf course now.
It ruins it.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, childhood memories for my daughter. So I'd ride my bike and I'd think about these donuts. It was early before I was Amazon, and I was like, God, I really want to make some donuts. And so I figured out how to make apple cider donuts, which were these donuts they'd serve at this little farm outside of Albany, New York, in a town called Altamont. So, I tried making them at home. I got the recipe, got out the Dutch oven, and, it was big vision for nice, traditional fall harvest kind of donuts. And really, it's just a bunch of grease burns. The kitchen is a total wreck. It smells like grease for days. If you've ever made donuts at home, anybody ever make donuts at home? Yeah, it's not something that's particularly easy. And it scales only to the size of my Dutch oven for each batch. The donut cost is quite high because you're screwing up a lot. They take hours per batch. It's just really not a great experience. So I think, what we really want to get to is a donut factory. This thing produces 730 dozen per hour. That's 8,760 donuts per hour. So there's a lot of consistency here between handmade donuts and donuts in the donut factory, between the information security world. And the direction that IT is going, and engineering in every company is becoming a software company. And to do this right, you don't want handmade donuts. You really want the donut factory. So you want to?
Yeah, so the key here is, if you'll note on this particular device, right, it has actual guardrails. And we're going to talk about guardrails because that's a kind of a key principle, but it has actual guardrails. We don't want donuts falling off. And it really is fundamental to kind of building a culture of food safety and at scale, right? So what we're trying to do is think about the same characteristics when we bring it over into a security culture. How do we think about the operating environment, and how do we really build kind of that safety culture, that security culture into the mix?
So you get consistent donuts, right? It's cheaper to make thousands and thousands of donuts an hour than it is to, make them by hand. It takes a really long time. Same thing with software, right? You want consistency in the software that you build. It's already going fast. It's faster than a lot of the security industry can currently absorb. So you need to have a culture to move as fast as the development organization is moving to.
So some people say, well, hey, but these don't taste as good as handcrafted donuts in your kitchen. But I'd argue it still does the job of a donut, right? It fills a void. It goes with coffee.
It's true. So let's take a look at some of these primitives and what we mean by these. First, and you've heard this if you're at Reinforce and you're an AWS customer, you've probably heard the term shared responsibility. It's a term that defines what you inherit from us and what we're responsible for as a cloud provider, and the controls that you need to operate in your own portion of shared responsibility within your AWS accounts. So you really have to understand this model. And there's, the exercise is really understanding the services being used in an architecture. So as a security team, we found in our highly successful customers, they're very, very clear about the services that they understand, whether that's through a concept of service whitelisting, managed through service control policies, or just a communication page, a wiki, a site that really says, hey, security's really dove into these services, and we understand what you're able to use and how to set up those guardrails in those services. We understand the features in those services, and we can be a partner in helping engineering use those services in a really safe way. So as security practitioners and as leaders, taking the time to really understand the services that are being used. It also means working with your development teams to see what they're using in their architectures. So that seems, common sense, but we find that, there's 168 or 106, well, we launched a few more today, so there's over 168 services at AWS, and you can compose architectures and applications in so many different ways. So having a process for understanding shared responsibility, not as an entire enterprise, but as those workloads come across your desk, you're understanding what services are composed in the architecture and what the security implications of that are. Identifying the controls you inherit from AWS. And this is an exercise that we spend an enormous amount of time with customers on, upfront, really, really early in the process and the engagements we have with you. We want you to understand what we give you. So things like physical security controls, hypervisor controls, network controls, the enforcement of identity and authorization. Those are all things that you can inherit from us. And so we're trying to take an action-oriented approach to this talk, and we'll try to leave you with actions that you can go and take. You want to take that one?
Yeah, so we have a number of different services, one of which, and I really hope people are familiar with this, is AWS Artifact. AWS Artifact really came in response to a lot of customers asking us for the ability to see our control documentation. So all of the various audits and attestations and certifications that we do on our core platform, customers wanted to have the ability to get that whenever they needed it in order to support their own either internal or external audit processes. Because again, you're inheriting those controls. So Artifact is accessible through the console. If it's not something that you're familiar with, I'd encourage you to go look at it. There may be control documentation that's out there that would be helpful for your internal audit or external aspects. The other is that we've introduced a lot of security-specific control language in our service documentation. And in fact, we just actually pushed out quite a bit of new additional content across a set of our services, specifically beefing out all of the security language in that service documentation. So really encourage you to go there. That's kind of a definitive source for us. We try to push as much into that space as possible. You'll also be seeing references to this in blogs. We have a security blog, and often will point to these types of releases as something that helps you. You know, and the notion in the shared responsibility model is that the line moves, right? So it used to be a fairly simple line when we were just dealing with compute resources and simple storage. But now we have a lot of managed services, right? So everything from, you know, a Fargate that was mentioned earlier today, something like that, where we're increasing the amount of management capability we're providing in a service. And so that's, you know, the importance of really understanding what are those services and what controls are you inheriting? What are you really responsible for? So that shared responsibility line does move a little bit up and down depending on the combination of service deployed.
One of the other primitives, and it comes to the topic of this slide, which is the legal, the audit, and the regulators as your stakeholders, leaning in very early to them, not avoiding the audit, but really just, you know, getting ready for it. So we spend a lot of time on control mapping too. So now that you understand the controls you inherit from AWS, we typically encourage customers to take on a control mapping exercise. So leverage your existing control frameworks, please. You know, I get asked a lot of, I need a cloud security strategy. Well, you have a security strategy in your enterprise already. Cloud is a deployment target. It is a technology. It's not a control framework that you need to reinvent. If you use ISO or NIST or PCI or whatever your control framework is, if it's an amalgam of all of the global regulations, it's probably good. And you can map us into that. The control objectives don't change in the cloud. The control design, the control implementation, the control artifacts or evidence, those may change. And that's the real exercise, is really understanding the code base for critical controls. Everything is software now. So you can define the controls in the way you build CloudFormation or Terraform templates. You can define what the network architecture is, the identity architecture, the alerts and the logging flow. All that can be codified. So as security professionals, when you're looking at the platform that's going to deploy things to the cloud, or you have individual teams in the enterprise configuring the environment, identify those areas in their code repositories that are essential for implementing and operating that control effectively. And with modern software repositories, you can set up notifications very, very easily. So as security practitioners, getting to know how to work with repos and where these controls are stored and how they're deployed is essential, because it'll tell you if you have deviations from your controls. You don't need to go and do a manual review over and over again if you're monitoring for drift in the control environment. So documenting and identifying the control owners and control design per part of the stack. It's not something that's new to the cloud. People have done this in infrastructure for a very long time, is you have different control owners for different parts of an application stack. Sometimes people own the core identity platform, some people own the network, some people own the application code. But that documentation still needs to exist in a cloud world. We find that it's very easy to move fast, super easy to move fast in the cloud, and sometimes the engineering teams get ahead of their audit stakeholders. And the third lines of defense, the second lines of defense, the security teams as a whole, however you want to define it, so that documentation sometimes just isn't keeping up. And it's important as leaders to acknowledge that you need to take the time for those things before an audit. So, and we talked about building in notifications for changes. Lastly, this is something that I think is underestimated in the time and the resources it takes to get successful and meaningful migrations in the cloud, is educating the other stakeholders who are not even as close. So we started out working with developers who could go on the internet with a credit card and build a new startup. And they didn't necessarily engage the security teams, if they have one. And now we're working with major enterprises all around the world. And the engineering teams are moving fast, and we're seeing pretty good engagement with the security and compliance organizations. But we're still seeing the outer edges of that, the audits, the auditor community, the technical IT audit community, the regulatory community. We've done a lot to try to educate that community, and we need your help. So as a security practitioner, if you're a compliance professional, you see the enterprise moving to the cloud, go out and find your IT auditors. If you're leaders, find the leader of IT audit and ask them to put in their budgets, in their annual planning, time for their auditors to learn the cloud. And so you're not spending on your dime trying to get through an audit and try to get something into production and try to explain the design changes or the implementation changes of a control, because last year or the year before, the audit might have been taking place in a data center environment. So it's just important to give them the time to learn, and it cuts down on the friction in audits.
So one of the areas that is increasingly becoming part of the conversations that I'm having with a lot of customers is the area of privacy. And the thing about privacy is that it's not security. And it's not really compliance, though it often gets usually handled by one of those two parties. And I have a lot of conversations with people who are in security roles, and they're asking, what are we going to do about GDPR? What should we do about the California Consumer Privacy Act? What do I do about other things, right? And it often comes up as a concern. So really the key difference here with privacy is that it's really the focus is on the data, not the controls. If you think about the privacy law generally doesn't speak to very specific sets of controls. And you could try to search for them, you're not going to find them. Right? It's going to really speak very specifically to a lot of the legal obligations, but probably more to the obligations that you have with respect to people who give you data, those data subjects. Right? And it's going to really define the interrelationship that you have down your supply chain, on the data supply chain, and with respect to those data subjects. The other is that it's really not just for attorneys. Like, this isn't just a subject for the attorneys to go handle. We really need security professionals at the table to think about privacy. And it's really how you're going to think about planning and specifically engaging with privacy professionals. I've had a few conversations with various security pros and customers, and I ask them who's responsible for privacy in your organization, and sometimes I get blank looks. We really want you to be engaging with people who have that kind of responsibility, and increasingly there are people who own the title of Chief Privacy Officer, or at least privacy professionals inside the organization. And then use those attorneys, the attorneys that you work with, to really help you navigate the legal risk and to try to think about the obligations that you may have when you're designing controls relative to handling that data and protecting that data. There's an area of designing for privacy, or really thinking about how I'm going to architect for privacy. It's a bit different than architecting for security, because it's really thinking from the perspective of not a control, but really the data and the obligations that I have around that. And really if you collect it, we often talk about data minimization, right, as a core practice. If you collect it, you got to protect it, right? And so you really want to be thinking about, do I need to have that data? Do I need to retain that data for a period of time if I'm not legally bound to retain that data? Because it does then impose a set of control obligations on you. I want you to think about designing for your donut eaters, right? They want to know where the dough's been, right? If you think about it, the right to know there's a right of disclosure. They get the right to know how that data is going to be used, who saw it, right? That means you're going to have to be, all of a sudden now, it's very important for you to be doing logging, monitoring, keeping those logs, being able to present that information to a consumer in a way that makes sense, because that's an obligation that you're inheriting. So it's not just you're designing your control infrastructure and your monitoring just for your security analysts, but you're going to be thinking about and managing this for your customers as well. I would encourage you to really challenge kind of the default collection and retention practices that have existed. We just keep our data forever. We collect it, we keep it forever, right? That might not necessarily be to your advantage anymore. You don't have the right to suddenly spin up an analytics business on data that you didn't actually get permission from the customer to do. And in many cases, you would then have to go reconsent that process. And I'd really encourage you to anticipate the data subject access requests. Under privacy law, we give data subjects, all of us, when we're not in our security lives, all of us, the right to ask about our data, to see it presented to us, back to us. What did I provide? Who's seen it? How was it used? I'd like it not to be sold. I'd like you to erase me. This puts a lot of pressure on security, right? So we need to know about privacy. Going back to that time for education, I would ask for you to create time for you to become aware about the privacy obligations. We're right about 6 months until the implementation of the California Consumer Privacy Act. Goes live January 1st, 2020. The enforcement kicks off in July of that next year, so almost a year from now. And that's going to impact probably a good portion of the businesses that are represented in this room. And so the pressure on security is really, how am I going to do authentication of data subjects at scale? When a data subject comes to me, how do I know they are who they are? I have to know that, because if I give them data and it isn't them, I breached. There's a really fine challenge that happens in this space with respect to providing this data to data subjects, and that is, typically you have these type 1, type 2 errors. I need to be really sensitive or really specific. Well, in this world, we have to be both. I have to get the data that I have about you. I have an obligation for that. And then I have an obligation to give you just your data and not anybody else's. It's going to have an impact on how you do DR, your disaster recovery. How do you back up? How do you store? What happens if somebody comes in and says, you know what, I'd like a deletion of my data? Have you thought through how you would do that against your DR infrastructure? Right? So we need to understand the impact of those deletion requests. Does it break things? Who will do the response? How do we get that from archive? This morning in the keynote, talked a little bit about lake formation. We are introducing a lot of controls into the data lake architecture that really allows for good separation and fine-grained access control around the data. Take advantage of that. Use that for accounting for disclosures, because you're going to need it. So that's one of the things. Again, it's not just for your analysts, it's really also for you to be able to respond to the community of customers. And then really think about automating the data lifecycle. Again, get rid of data that you don't need. If you really don't need it, there's not a legal reason, there's not a business reason, it's essentially toxic waste. And you need to be thinking about, how do I not maintain that reliability and the need for keeping those controls in place.
Thanks. So now we've talked about some primitives and the things that a lot of technology practitioners might not prioritize and assume that other stakeholders in the enterprise are doing that. So I think the things we've talked about, the primitives around engaging with legal early, thinking about privacy, some of the foundational things, control mapping, are really important, and it'll help you go fast and build that foundation. So we'll talk a little bit now about speed. One of the leadership conversations we have at Amazon a lot around security is, I think, a peculiar one. And it's our VP and distinguished engineer, Eric Brenwine, who's giving another talk at this conference, talks a lot about driving down the cost of engagement. And what that means is it should be very simple for an engineer to come to security in a low-cost way. And what I mean by low cost is not the monetary cost per se, but the friction. If it takes a long time to get an application security engineer assigned to a workload review or to a new application going live, it slows the business down at a minimum, or they avoid you, which is worse. So driving that cost of engagement, we don't want to do things that are painful and difficult. Humans just naturally don't do that. So if the cost is very low and you make it very simple to engage a security team, you'll get better satisfaction from the engineering community and more attention and mind share based on security. So one of the things we focus on a lot is building mechanisms and things like durable long-term advantage. It's one of the ways we think about our organizational planning, or what are the things we can invest in early that are going to give us advantage later. And Steve talked a lot about Nitro this morning, or Abby talked about Nitro this morning. We talked a little bit about some of the things that it took to build that. We fabricate our own chips. We kind of refactored the design of the hypervisor. And what that allowed us to do, though, is come out with things like Firecracker and be able to take advantage of those hardware investments over time to really eliminate categories of risk and to move even faster once those things took years to get in production. But now we have this long-term durable advantage around Nitro that we can build off of and get additional security advantage. So thinking about that for your own organization, what are those, the action here as leaders and practitioners is to identify the investments that pay forward. We really think, and you've heard us talk about this a lot, is investing in understanding software delivery pipelines. So continuous integration, continuous deployment, the way that software is built today through agile methodologies, really deeply understanding that the pipeline is the donut factory. So it's the way that things get built and deployed. You need to walk the factory floor and deeply understand how the dough, in this case code, gets to be a donut. which is an application that hosts the glaze, the sprinkles, the frosting, the filling, which is the data. And so if as a security practitioner, I really, really encourage you to sit next to developers for a long period of time if you haven't done it in a while. As leaders, both engineering and security leaders, give the people time to collaborate that way. You can't walk in an interrupt-driven way and understand how software development's happening. If you're a developer yourself and you're in a security team, that's amazing. We're seeing that trend. We're seeing a lot of companies hire engineers and SDEs and SREs or however, the engineering developers into the security organization to build the tooling and to help the business line engineering teams move much faster. So find out who's making those handcrafted donuts and getting grease burns on their arms and messing up the kitchen. Things to look for, where is their SSH access? Where is it enabled? Because there's the likelihood that people are still hanging on to manual configuration changes. Where are the changes being made to an environment outside that pipeline? Because if you trust the pipeline and you put all your static analysis and dynamic analysis and the tooling and everything in that pipeline and rely on it for quality change control and the approvals and the things you need, if there's code changes, if there's outside the pipeline, there's typically an area where you can add those to the donut factory recipe box that you're going to make later. So it's not that you just go shut people down and say no. It's you understand that there's pain and friction there that they don't have tooling and automation built around. So the best way as security people to figure out how to raise the bar on automation and remove the humans from the software delivery process as much as possible, and certainly from production, is to go find those sharp edges in the areas where things are being done manually. So we talk about embedding security in engineering teams in development factory. So again, we know that security teams are generally much smaller than the broader development and engineering parts of their organization, so the ratio is just off. So you don't have to do this forever because it wouldn't simply scale. But early on, and putting an engineer, a security engineer, into the teams of the developers and sitting them in their sprints, working through their backlogs, working through a couple sprints to deliver an application, to understand the tooling they're using, the way they're doing things, both from a repo management as well as like all the tests and test coverage and the way they're pushing code. It gives you a real firsthand opportunity to live the life of a developer. And as security folks, we want to drive down that cost of engagement. So that user experience has to be really strong for the developer to use the tools that you're providing. So it doesn't scale, like I said, to put a security person into every single team. If you're a security team of 20 and you have 1,000 developers or whatever, you just can't do it. So one thing that we've seen a lot of successful customers getting to is building and managing your own security tooling and APIs, similar to the way that the microservices would work between architectures. Security teams can build their own, essentially, microservices. There's a good starting list. Things like secret service. So having the security team manage AWS Secrets Manager. So you know it's being done effectively. You can deal with the authorization policies appropriately. We've seen a lot of customers where the security team kind of runs or co-runs the AMI, or Amazon Machine Image Factory. So building new golden images for EC2 instances all the time. Every night you bake a new AMI, and every time there's a code deploy or a new version of the application code that relies on that AMI, they're pushing the whole new thing into production and just wipe out the old unpatched stuff. A lot of security teams build and vend single sign-on wrappers for the CLI or the SDKs, so that you can integrate not only the console experience, but the developer or the engineers or the operations team's CLI access. So lots of good stuff out there. I think this is a great conference for sharing these ideas. We want you to share your ideas broadly. And what I mean by that is we want to hear from you. If you're building tooling on top of us, is that something you want to do because it's multi-cloud or hybrid or because it's kind of bespoke for you? Or is it something we should take the feedback on and make the services better? We want you to share your ideas broadly with each other. That's why you come physically to Boston, as opposed to watching all the YouTube videos or watching webinars. There's a huge opportunity here just to hit up your neighbor and say, what are you working on? What are you building? We really focus on builders, and we have things like the security jam, the builder sessions, the workshops, where you have an opportunity in maybe a smaller environment to share some of those ideas with us and with each other. We talk a lot about mechanisms and freeing up the engineers to reduce that friction. So I'll share a little bit about what we do at AWS and in our AppSec team. We have an affinity program. So when a service team comes through for the first time and they're building a new service, we have a couple of AppSec engineers working with them on their threat models, on their design reviews, on their code reviews, the pen tests, all the things we do pre-flight to a service launching. And when they go back later on and they have this service out there and they start adding features and features and features, that creates surface area. We need to look at it again. And so we have, they have some discretion. but everything goes through security reviews, right? So how do you lower that cost of engagement? So when they come back to the AppSec team, if it's something new, we might want some fresh eyes on it. But if it's something that's a small change, they don't want to have to re-explain the architecture to our AppSec engineer. So we try to keep an affinity between the application security engineers who work with the service team and those service teams when they come back, because it lowers their cost of engagement. We have a bar raiser program. So there's several folks running around here who are part of our crypto bar raiser team. We want crypto everywhere. And we have some good primitives like KMS and some things that, we have our SDKs, we have our internal tooling. So when our service teams build things with encryption, they're expected to raise the bar. And ciphers and the algorithms are not particularly hard to implement, but the integration of those algorithms and key management and the way you do crypto in a system can be complicated. And we want it to be continually raising that bar. So using S2N properly, using the right TLS libraries and cipher suites and things like that. So we have a bar raiser program, and anybody can reach out to them. It's about, it's a good group of actual cryptographers at AWS, where our service teams can contact them and say, hey, I'm doing something with crypto. I need you to take a look at it. We have a principal review program. So there's a lot of principal engineers across Amazon. The AWS community of principal engineers is pretty esteemed in terms of distributed computing and solving hard problems at scale. So anybody building a service can reach out to that principal community for a principal review. And you get a bunch of people who might be interested in the same problem space, and they can help you architect better. We also do something that I think is kind of novel. We have what we do an AppSec customer satisfaction survey. So at the end of every AppSec review, this is just a graph from, I think, a couple years ago. And again, not everybody responds, so the numbers are relative to the number of responses. But we really we ask the question, my overall experience with AWS security during the review was, great, good, okay, or not okay, right? So we really dive in to anything that's not a fantastic experience. We want to know what went wrong. Did the team come to us too late? Did we not have the right resources available? Was there misunderstanding in the process? Was the architecture kind of a moving target the whole time? There's a lot of things that can go wrong. We generally want to have a high satisfaction rate. And so if you're trying to build mechanisms to lower friction and to drive down the cost of engagement, you have to measure it to know that you're doing it properly. And I think this is one of the ones that Steve looks at. We all look at it pretty frequently, is the AppSec team performing a service? Their motto is kind of ship secure code, right? But that implies not just the secure part, it implies the ship part. You have to ship code. And so we couldn't launch, the number of features and services we launched if we had and still be secure, if we had a high bar and a high friction of engagement. Take it over.
So one of the things that we get in a lot of conversations with customers frequently about, so how do you guys do things at AWS? And I would say that we spend a lot of time kind of striving, and one of the things that Bill talked about in terms of the CSAT thing is generally when you get a low score, that spawns a thing that we call a correction of errors, or a process where we go and specifically dive in and ask 5 whys, 5-why process to try to get to what was the root cause for why something didn't happen the way it should have happened. And is there some way in which we can build a mechanism to prevent that from happening? And so mechanism is really a system in which there's a set of processes with feedback. And it's a way of creating some durable, repeatable action with signal that tells you that you're either on target or not on target. And so we go and try to constantly kind of add to that and develop that. One of the things, though, that as we were talking about this, is that we want to take, we want you all, and we certainly try to do this, is really use the wisdom that we have as risk professionals. Like, one of the things about security people is they have a kind of an ear and an eye for things where there is abnormal risk, right? And the ability to kind of see and ferret out things where we might be taking a risk, where we might have failure points. And those are good things to bring up to the business because they have an assumption of, things absolutely always working, great optimism, but we also want them to be aware of and engineer in the points of control and the ways of mitigating risk that we're taking on. One of the things that we do and we see with customers is really having lots of small autonomous teams. A lot of what you'll see in terms of when we do delegated administration and a variety of other services is really how do we create the ability for people to invent? How do we give controls to people so that they can invent and be creative within a context in which we're monitoring for kind of bad activity, right? So we want people to be able to go and be inventive with small teams. We have a concept that we call two pizza teams. It's a small group of people who are working with relatively high autonomy to build new services, to experiment. We'd encourage you to think about cloud centers of excellence. This is really building a community of practice, having an opportunity for people to talk amongst each other about what are the experiences that you're having using various cloud services, cloud controls, how you're handling control mapping, how you're approaching audit, where you've had difficulty, and really building out this kind of community inside your organization. The other is that there's probably a lot of cloud practitioners in your communities. And there's meetup groups where people get together and they can talk about things. And I'd encourage you to get involved in the meetup groups that are meeting to talk about what's happening with cloud platforms and what are people learning and how are they experiencing that. And think about that as really your virtual center of excellence in your virtual community.
Can I add something, Bill, to that? So one of the things with the cloud centers of excellence is we don't want to recreate some of the committees and the boards and the groups that had to review architectures before things could move forward. So I've seen in a lot of customers there is a cloud center of excellence, and it kind of goes, one of two ways. One is this is a collaborative group of really productive individuals who solve hard problems at scale. They have skill sets from across the enterprise. They know the resources and the leaders they know the leaders who can deploy and commit resources, but it's not an approval board necessarily, right? It may be, but it needs to be very, very, very fast if that's the case. If you end up in the world where you had, sort of this quarterly meeting of the committee or the monthly review board of the new architecture, it just doesn't work anymore. So the Cloud Center of Excellence is a builder team. It may be consisting of leaders and people from across the organization, but it is a team of builders typically. And the goal is to get things into the cloud and to make changes very, very quickly in the cloud. And keeping that tenant at the top of mind for a Cloud Center of Excellence is absolutely important. If it becomes the kind of the group that you have to gate through, it just doesn't work out. So from a perspective of highly successful cloud customers, those Cloud Centers of Excellence, look at the customers that are on stage at reInvent or at Reinforce. Those customers typically have a pretty dynamic Cloud Center of Excellence going on in these large enterprises who are doing mass migrations. So ask them, hit them up. They're in the community. Ask the community heroes, some of them who are in the audience. Ask your peers and how they're doing it and what's working and what's not.
Yeah, and it's really getting away from that kind of the board, the change control board of no, right? Which is really not kind of what we want to be known for, right? We want to be enabling the business. We want to enable people to do things, but we want them to do it in a kind of a risk-appropriate way. Bill talked a little bit about staffing away teams. Staffing an away team, it's really giving people the opportunity, again, to sit with developers, right? It's really to be part of the process, not to sit on the side. We don't want, hey, we did a little bit of education, then we stepped away and we let people do stuff, and then they had to come and get approval before we would let them ship anything out the door. And we will typically find lots of flaws, and then we'll tell them to go back and redo it. We really want to get embedded. We want people to be thinking right from the beginning. Teach them how to do threat modeling. Teach them how to think about secure pipelines. Understand where those friction points are that Bill talked about earlier. The other is that we see a lot of customers really trying to put a premium on adaptability and high judgment. And this goes with the small autonomous teams. You got to push and build those teams, but expect that, one, the small nature of those teams means that they iterate, they're going to be adaptable, but we want high judgment in those cases. We want to have a high expectation about what that bar is, what they're building, and how they're approaching things. But again, we want this kind of culture of experimentation. One of the things that we do in our organization, and for those of you familiar with Amazon has these leadership principles, we kind of put a premium on learn and be curious coupled with ownership. Like, we want people to get out and be curious about how things work. Right? The best way for you to really understand how something works as a service or a control is to go try it, to experiment. We want experimentation. We want people to test the integration points and how the services get configured. But we also want people to have responsibility and ownership over that. And that means that that's bringing other people along, but it's also, again, using some high judgment about whether that service is really production ready. And so your actions are really about building a model for fast and safe experimentation, building those kinds of sandboxes and the ability to support that.
We see a lot of customers doing that. We see a lot of customers, the account growth within our customer base is pretty high. A lot of customers at scale have hundreds or thousands of AWS accounts. And now with the organizations, it's easier to manage. We heard it was rather challenging to manage thousands of accounts. And what happens a lot of times is you have curious people who want to help the business. They've got a great idea, and now they can experiment and fail quickly, or they can prove concept very quickly. And so you end up with a lot of accounts across an organization that might not yet be centrally managed. And we understand that can be a challenge for security organizations. We made the mechanisms to bring them into the fold with organizations and to apply those guardrails, kind of the CISO edict from the top down. You can do that in a largely centralized way now with service control policies and permission boundaries and a lot of things we've launched in the last year. But we don't want to stop, and we don't want to create friction for that experimentation. So it's finding the right balance of letting people open their own AWS accounts and get them governed easily and quickly. If they know they have to go through a very high bar to even be at the table to get an experimentation account, they're going to avoid that. And you lock up innovation in the enterprise if you're not easily vending out the accounts for people to try things with. So what we've seen, and we can help with this, we have lots of good models for this. We have partners, we have professional services, or you can just build it yourself, is basically a vending machine. Now, Control Tower is generally available as well. So you can vend accounts out very easily and also govern them. And then having things like a Reaper that goes and destroys the resources in that account if they don't positively re-up or after a given period of time. And that, again, it takes some tooling, it takes some engineering, but you build that durable advantage when you invest in something like Control Tower or Landing Zone, which is a similar architecture, or just a vending machine of some sort that deploys accounts easily, safely allows a developer to experiment with something, and then destroys it without a long-term plan to take it in production. Then you don't want that going live. But the idea is that you have a very, very low bar to being able to try something out and get going. So lots of examples of that.
And very often, if you see a lot of email accounts using your domain with personal credit cards, that's an example of where people are trying to experiment, right? They say, here's my email, but now they're trying to open up accounts on their credit cards, right? So that often people come and say, well, we got to get all those accounts wrangled in. But really, that's an example of where people are trying to get access to experimentation. Learn by doing. This is an event that has a lot of workshops. The other things that we do, we run a variety of different workshops at various places, whether it's at reInvent, here at Reinforce. We do Loft Security Weeks in San Francisco, New York, and globally. We do roadshows where we have hands-on workshops. But the other thing that we're committed to doing is pushing that workshop material out to GitHub for you guys to use. So we have repos that are out there for you to be able to take CloudFormations and step-by-step instructions about how to deploy that so that you can use those same workshops that we've built and done inside our lofts or inside any of the workshops. So we make those freely available for you. We want you to be able to experiment with them, use them. They can be sample architectures or they can just be used to help people get familiar with a set of services. And typically they're built around a solution and not a single service because we want people to be able to put building blocks together. So a threat detection workshop, for example, will have you go from the beginning all the way to the end of doing some automated remediation using Lambda. So we try to do that and allow you guys to be able to do that, and we do it so that you guys can take advantage of it.
I'll take the next one. It maybe seems simple, but what we find is that people just aren't asking for what they need. And in the organizations that are highly successful in the cloud, there's a path to getting what you need. And budgets might be limited, but we find that the people working on the day-to-day migration work might not be the people who can allocate resources. And so asking for what you need in a measured way, and we can help with this. We understand what it takes to put a couple of sprints together to get SSO integration done, for example. We know what it takes in a number of sprints or the amount of work to take logs and aggregate them in CloudWatch events and CloudWatch logs and event bus and everything else and pull those events into a SIM and build the Lambda functions on top of them to do automatic remediation, notification, integrate things with Security Hub, all of the things we've done it before. And these highly successful cloud customers have done it before. And they know what it takes. They know if it takes a certain amount of staff or a certain amount of time or a partner or consultants to help you. It's just you have to ask, and ask us, ask your account teams, ask your TAMs, your SAs, your account manager who's working with you as a customer, hey, who's done this before? How long do you think this will take? How many people should I put on this for, is it a week? Is it 6 months? And so a lot of the meetings I have with customers is really about, it's not about the APIs, they work as described on the box, but the important part is being able to get the culture and the leadership right of allocating resources such that you get the work done. Define a partner strategy. And I don't mean by, I do mean, but also in addition to that, to technology partners, like in the security competency we have in the Amazon Partner Network, define who are your partners. And as security organizations, you might not have all the development chops and people on staff yet. And that's changing in the industry. People are becoming more developer-centric in the security community, but you got to build a partner strategy for someone else. In the CTO's organization, the CIO, whoever's building the applications, we talked about away teams. It works both ways. So you not only send security people into dev teams to learn from them, but also have them be an away team with you. We have this concept in Amazon called an away team. If you need something built and the other team you take a dependency on another team and you need a feature in that dependency you're taking, if they don't have the cycles to build it, you don't want to go off and build a complete replacement for the one feature that you need, even though you're already using 99 of their features. So you send a developer over there for a couple of sprints, get the feature built, and then everybody else gets it too. So it works both ways. All those security services I mentioned that you can be building as a security team to offer up to your enterprise, you might not be able to build them all yourself as fast as you'd like, but everybody needs them, right? You need WAF rule management. You need identity integration. You need all those things, and the teams that want to build and experiment in the cloud might have the developer and engineering resources that you need to get that work done, to unblock them. So they can be your partners too. Leveraging the available resources. So there's an enormous amount of documentation and quick starts and videos and GitHub repositories and all kinds of things out there that we can help you find. So instead of inventing from scratch and rebuilding all the security architecture and services that we've talked about, customers have done it before. So leverage your account teams, leverage the AWS website, leverage the partner ecosystem. A lot of the resources are already out there. So I've observed over thousands of customer conversations, there's two kinds of, two things. Organizations that dedicate resources to the cloud and organizations that are adopting the cloud. So let's put those together. This was the hardest part of the presentation. I thank Bill Reid for putting these into donuts. But the successful AWS customers are the ones that dedicate resources to security and cloud adoption. So it's possible to dedicate resources to cloud security and not get any success. You can put a lot of people on a problem, but if the business isn't motivated, if you don't have the right leadership in place, you can dedicate a lot of resources and not get any meaningful success out of the cloud. You can also say you're all into the cloud and that you want to migrate and you want to take advantages of it, but without dedicating the resources, you don't get to be a successful cloud customer. I'd say it's not hard work, it's just work. And someone has to do it. And we find oftentimes that I talk to customers in executive briefings, or we go on site to customers, and we ask, this just isn't getting done, and we can't move forward. We can't do the integrations with on-prem stuff. We can't go to production. We're not allowed to put sensitive data in the cloud yet. And you ask, well, whose day job is cloud security? You're like, oh, that person, well, they're also running the on-prem SIM and the on-prem WAF rules, and they're trying to do it in the cloud too. And there's a learning curve at times, and you have to dedicate resources up front if you want to be a successful cloud customer. Escalation. So as a culture inside of AWS security, and Amazon in general, we talk a lot about escalation. And I don't just mean that pagers are going off because there's a security event or issue. I mean escalation of things like risk, or escalation of decisions. And escalation is just for your information. So we encourage a healthy culture of escalation. We train our people to do it. The thing that's most frustrating to our leadership is when things are not escalated quickly enough. Being able to look out and see, oh, this is going to become an issue in the future if we don't get leaders' eyes on it to make decisions early. So we really want people to escalate and build mechanisms for it. You want to talk about some of those?
Yeah, so we have, kind of a lot of Amazon runs on tickets, ticketing systems, and we escalate through tickets. And so you'll often hear people talk about and encourage people to understand how to do a Sev2 ticket. So Sev2 ticket it's customer impacting. You got to move on this. This is super important, and we want people to do that. We don't want people to bury it and think, well, that would be, kind of a judgment on me, or I'm not doing my job. We really want, you're not doing your job if you don't escalate and get the right help early. And we really try to build that out in terms of those kinds of mechanisms. The other thing that we do is we create space for this to be a practice, for looking at escalations, to manage them, to really do this in a disciplined way. So there's kind of standing meetings where we look at what's happening, what are the issues, and we create the space for the review of those early in the process. So if I escalate but nobody can respond because we're maxed and we don't have the capacity, then that's a problem. If I have no way to escalate and it's high friction, then people don't escalate. So we want to kind of create both of those, the space to do that as well. And then this notion of blameless. Again, there is no blame placed on individuals for escalating. We want escalation to happen. It's a hard concept for people sometimes to kind of go, really? You want me, this might not be going the way I anticipated. You really want me to escalate this? Yes, we really do.
Yeah, we build mechanisms in as well. So Steve and a group of security leaders at AWS meet with Andy, our CEO, every week. We have a planned meeting where the CISO talks to the CEO about whatever the issues are, whether it's future looking or current issues. If you don't have that mechanism, then it's a fire drill. And you learn from the fire drills, when there are fire drills, that, hey, we had this fire drill. We didn't know how to make this decision. We had to escalate it. So what do? You don't want to have that fire drill again. You build in a mechanism, and it could just be a weekly meeting. It could be if you know things are going to happen every week. The internet and security in general always has something going on, and you always need to talk about it. And having a forum to do that at the right levels of the organization is really, really critical. So most of the folks in AWS security have this on their out-of-office reply. So basically, it's for urgent active security issues, please contact AWS security. Page us or cut a Sev2. If you're not sure what to do, really, it's okay. So we really want people to escalate. We make an effort to do that. So, and practice it. You really want to practice that escalation. So it could be actual game days, having those mechanisms in place. Meet frequently about security, and have those real game days. So not just a tabletop exercise. And we will do this with you as partners. Security incident response simulations are critically important. If you escalate, if you actually wait for security incidents to happen, people won't have the right access keys, they won't know the console, they won't necessarily have SSO roles or identity roles in the right accounts. So for security issues, like active security issues, it's very, very important to practice the incident response. Can you get forensic snapshots of EBS volumes? It is about practicing those mechanisms for incident response too, and the actual operations of things that might escalate, degraded services, things like that in your environment. But really, it's the management concept of escalation. So if we're trying to move a workload into the cloud and we need approvals or we need risk decisions to be made, escalate those appropriately on both sides. If you're a security person, you think you're taking on too much risk by making a certain architecture, escalate it the other way. But it's a blameless escalation, and it should be something that we highly encourage. So we have about 5 minutes left. Maybe have a little time for questions. But one of the things we'll try to leave you with, and I do a lot of training of the staff internally about how to talk about security with customers, because for a lot of folks who are not career security professionals, we have a lot of solution architects who come from IT and development and other areas. They're not always comfortable having that security conversation. Because it is about risk sometimes, or about threats and vulnerabilities and those kinds of things. But I think as a security industry, we need to be optimistic. And so I started showing this picture of this incredibly cute, happy otter, because you can't be pessimistic looking at this guy. You just can't. Everybody that I've shown this picture, and you put Optimism Otter up there, and it's memorable, and it helps people think about security differently. Like Steve said in the keynote today, it's going pretty good, right? I mean, the cloud gives you a pretty good advantage to make security fast and to stay in pace with the business, the regulatory landscape, and the threat landscape. And you have to be an optimistic security professional. I think we try, when we talk about security with customers, to show a brighter future where it's easy to get resources. You're not cost constrained in the same way you were. The buying models are different. You can experiment as security practitioners in ways that you've never have been able to before. And so I'm extremely optimistic. We gave him a donut because it's a donut talk, but I'm extremely optimistic about the concept of the donut factory, of really safe, clean, good guardrails, and ways to get security done. So, Bill?
Yeah, so with that, we have...
Roadshow, yeah.
Oh, well, that's right. One more slide. Just want to point out, we have a Global Security Roadshow. These are an event that we've been doing. We did roadshows in the US probably about 2 years ago, and we're beginning to roll these out again on a global basis. And so we're going to have these are one-day events that we're rolling out. If you'd like to, if these happen to be in a city near you, we'd encourage you to go there. We're going to do some labs, a lot of hands-on work, and give you a chance to dive into services.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks.